Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday the 16th of May in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the UK and European Union confront their differences as they race to finalise deals on immigration and defence ahead of Monday's summit.
Bloomberg understands that at least 5 sizable companies are mulling European IPOs in the coming weeks, in news that could help fuel a revival of public listings.
Plus, an exclusive report on the would-be care workers who've been exploited and squeezed for millions while seeking jobs in the UK.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
With days to go before a key EU-UK summit in London, the two sides are struggling to agree to a text on a defence and security partnership. Bloomberg has learned talks about the UK joining a €150 billion EU military fund have been held up by other issues on things like fishing rights and migration post-Brexit. The EU's Valdis Dombrovskis says the tone around the meeting is still upbeat.
There is this positive momentum. There is willingness from both sides, so to say, make a step towards each other. So I'm confident that we are going to see positive outcomes from the summit, and we are going to see also follow-up action from the summit.
That's the EU's Economy Commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis there. Improving the relationship has been a key ambition of UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer as he tried to improve Britain's weak economic outlook and build a closer alliance in uncertain geopolitical times.
America's top diplomat is downplaying hopes of a breakthrough in talks between Ukraine and Russia. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the likelihood of progress is low without a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump. But Russia has sent a low-level delegation to talks in Turkey today. Vladimir Putin spurning an offer by the Ukrainian leader to meet face-to-face. Volodymyr Zelensky was not impressed.
I think that the Kremlin leader should show his leadership. If he's ready for negotiations, let's meet. We can't really run around the world looking for him.
Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky speaking there through a translator. He also called the Russian delegation a, quote, sham. Focus now shifts to when President Trump could meet President Putin and whether the US would opt to hit Russia with a fresh round of sanctions. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has proposed a bill with what he calls bone-crushing sanctions against Moscow, which has enough support to pass the Senate, but it's not clear if President Trump would sign it.
Bloomberg understands that several sizable companies are considering listing on European stock exchanges in the coming weeks. A flurry of deals in the region could help fuel a global revival in IPO activity following recent market volatility. With more, here's Bloomberg's Chris Pitt.
At least 5 sizable firms are mulling listings in the region in the near future, according to sources who've spoken to Bloomberg. The companies including Autodoc, a German online car parts retailer backed by Apollo Global, and medical technology group Brainlab. Sweden's Hacksaw and Nordic capital-backed Nova Bank are also said to be considering imminent offerings. None of the companies would confirm exact timings on any possible listing when asked for comment from Bloomberg, but a successful IPO season in Europe could be a major boost after regional activity slowed to a crawl in April. In London, Chris Pitt, Bloomberg Radio.
As the UK Chancellor grapples with the challenge of her upcoming spending review here in the UK, a report by the country's independent public spending watchdog suggests that there is more scope to prize revenue from Britain's wealthiest taxpayers. Bloomberg's Ewan Potts has more.
The wealthiest 1% in the UK already contribute a quarter of all personal tax revenues. But a report today from the National Audit Office says that HMRC may be able to squeeze them for more. It gives credit to the Tax Office for efforts to tackle non-compliance, which generated £5.2 billion in the year to March 2024, a full £3 billion more than just 4 years earlier. But the NAO says that the bumper revenue secured so far suggests that the HMRC's estimate of the tax gap for the wealthiest, currently £1.9 billion, is actually far too low. It's a fair bet that Rachel Reeves is casting a careful eye over today's findings. In London, I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
A Ukrainian national has been charged with 3 counts of arson following a series of fires at properties linked to the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. 21-year-old Roman Lavrinovich is due in court later today. The charges relate to a fire at the entrance of a residential property owned by Starmer in the early hours of the 12th of May, as well as 2 other blazes.
Now to more global news. Japan's economy contracted by 0.7% on an annualised basis in the first 3 months of the year. The decline is more than twice what economists had estimated, and it raises concerns about the economy's resilience as President Trump's tariffs take effect. Japan says that it is continuing to seek a reprieve from the American levies and hopes to reach some form of agreement with the US next month.
Analysts say US President Donald Trump is likely to keep 30% tariffs on China until at least the end of this year. A Bloomberg survey of dozens of fund managers reveals low expectations of further levy cuts in the near future, despite ongoing negotiations. However, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, says she's still optimistic after both sides agreed to temporarily lower charges on each other's goods for 90 days.
I'm very encouraged, to be honest, because we had felt that any decoupling of China-US or breakdown in their trading relationship would have quite negative spillovers on the rest of the world, but especially on poor countries, especially if trade really fragments into 2 trading blocs. So the fact that there's been a de-escalation, an agreement to reduce tariffs to the extent they have, I think is a good sign.
Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala there speaking as Bloomberg Economics projected that current rates could still wipe out 70% of Chinese shipments to the US in the medium term.
Now, those are our top stories. Let's get to the markets. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index is weakening for a second session in a row, 0.2% lower. The yen and Swiss franc among the beneficiaries. 10-year Treasury yields are slightly lower. Traders are now pricing in 2 Fed rate cuts this year. You've also got surging Japanese yields, especially on the long end. Stocks, though, are now trading basically like last month throughout. Didn't happen. The S&P 500 only about 4% away from an all-time record high. So just looking at the stock futures for the European market open, we're up about 0.1%. But oil markets have also just moved. We're up by 0.4% for Brent and WTI crude futures after comments from Iran. Oil takers taking this series of headlines from Iran as positive potentially for crude. The fact that that Iran is talking about hearing many contradictory US positions, that seems to have moved those oil markets.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on the latest of a wrangling over the EU-UK reset ahead of Monday's summit and the results of a months-long investigation into the exploitation of care workers coming into the UK. But first, a word on another story that's caught our eye this morning. Bloomberg Opinion's Adrian Wooldridge has drawn up an interesting comparison as the direction that he sees the UK going in.
Yes, of course. And this one is close to your heart, Stephen, of course, because the comparison is to France. He points to French-style policies coming to the UK, things like the Labour Employment Rights Bill, a national energy champion, Great British Energy. The UK basically adopting a more presidential style of government, emulating perhaps a little bit the French system. He calls it the Frenchification of Britain.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an interesting... The comparisons are interesting because, you know, he points to survey evidence around people's attitude to work. You know, 43%. Yeah, exactly. 43% of Britons telling pollsters that it'd be a good thing if less importance was placed on work. That's 40% on the French side as well. People high value of their leisure activities. A lot of these comparisons, look, are things that are, and very apt when we're thinking about EU-UK relations, shared values between countries in Western Europe that have large social systems and, you know, are used to the kind of model of social democracy that exists in a lot of this part of the world.
Except and Adrian also makes an interesting comparison between Nigel Farage, akin maybe to the Gilets Jaunes movement in France, which I thought was interesting. But he points to one great difference, of course, which is, yes, French workers may enjoy their long August holidays, but they're very efficient, amongst the most efficient workers in the world. And he's slightly worried that the UK, with its low productivity, might not be able to deliver the same.
There's a tip for a good bakery in Battersea in there as well. It's worth reading, bloomberg.com/opinion, and we'll put a link to the story in our show notes as well.
Well, speaking of that UK-France relationship, Britain is set to host European leaders next week for an historic summit where the country wants to announce a reset of its relationship with the EU. But Bloomberg is reporting that although the mood music will be upbeat, talks between the two sides about tangible changes are really getting down to the wire. Our UK politics reporter James Woolcock joins us now for more on this. Good morning, James. What's going awry then in these crucial days ahead of this summit? Are the Brexit divisions back?
Caroline, you should know very well by now that Brexit never left. Look, the way America has pivoted on Ukraine and on global trade has put a rocket under the UK and the EU's attempts to sort of reset this relationship, especially around defence. But what we're reporting is this morning, the same old sores, be they fishing, be they migration, be they sovereignty and oversight, all that legal wrangling are likely to make what's announced on Monday a lot more limited than what might have initially been hoped, although talks are still ongoing ahead of this big Monday summit.
If we were to be thinking optimistically around what could be done within this as well, what would it mean for the UK economically at a challenging time internationally if a deal were to get over the line? And there's still time, we should point out, before the summit on Monday.
I think to understand that, you've got to break down a bit of what this deal could look like and why it's there. And so on that, you've got to give credit to Ellen Milligan and Alberto Nardelli, who are reporters who've been weeks ahead of the competition on this stuff. So it all comes down, it starts with this EU joint defence fund, which is worth 150 billion euros that was being set up. The UK wants to be part of it. It's originally set up for the 27 countries in the bloc. 2 weeks ago, we reported that in the first draft of this agreement that we're going to get on Monday, the UK wasn't mentioned as being part of this deal. And we were very upset here in Britain. And so then we hear that the EU coastal states, especially France, didn't want the defence part to be included unless fishing was dealt with. A post-Brexit fishing arrangement expires later this year. They wanted it extended, maybe as much as up to 7 years. They also wanted to be involved EU-UK food checks along the border, also called phytosanitary checks. They would like the deadline for those to be attached to fish. And so then it expands to migration. Spain's Prime Minister has talked about a youth mobility scheme. Then we wrap in the fact that Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, wants bilateral migration deals. And before you know it, what was supposed to be a defence pact now includes multiple other issues, multiple old sores, and what we're going to get on Monday is likely 3 documents: a defence and security partnership, potentially a common understanding, and sort of a talk about closer ties. And so to your point about economically, Stephen, there is a lot of money to be made here on defence. There is a lot of GDP to be improved on trade, food checks, and multiple other things. But there is so much murkiness on what is this future relationship going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that, though, on the flip side, the UK, of course, is home to a number of very big defence contractors, and that is also something that is quite appealing in some quarters in Europe to perhaps be able to involve them in those deals. But look, Keir Starmer made resetting relations with Europe a kind of key plank of his agenda. So how is he going to be talking about this?
Well, in many ways, we're seeing the kind of what's become quite the usual life cycle of a British Prime Minister come to power with a series of great things the EU could give them, only to run headfirst into sort of the rigid nature of negotiating with a bloc of 27 different countries. But look, 2 things are different this time around. Firstly, defence, we keep coming back to. The conversation is genuinely quite different amongst countries in Europe, and that has changed the picture. But the other thing that's changed is right-wing sentiment across Europe has changed too. Now, in some ways, that frees up Starmer and opens up new possibilities that weren't there in sort of 2019 when sort of Brexit talks were going on. In the other ways, could you imagine how it would look for on a week where he has said the experiment with open borders and migration is over, if he were then to agree to a UK mobility, a youth mobility scheme for young people in Europe? He's very concerned about domestic optics. So the one thing that has stayed the same is, although polls in the UK have shifted and now increasingly a majority of people would favour a better economic relationship with the EU, the Labour government's position on freedom of movement and on the free exchange of goods with the continent has not, and blocks of the European Union specifically, has not shifted at all.
OK, James Woolcock, our UK politics reporter, thank you.
Well, in a week where the UK government has also announced those big changes on the immigration and migration system in Britain, Bloomberg Business Week is reporting on how migrant care workers coming to Britain are being scammed out of millions of pounds by visa sharks. The government has failed to stamp out exploitation of its own health and care workers visa programme, which has seen 700,000 people, if you include dependents, come to the UK to perform essential caregiving. And our reporter, Lucy White, has been investigating this for a number of months for Bloomberg, and she joins us this morning. It's nice to see you, Lucy. What has been going wrong with this visa scheme? Can you give us the size and scope of the abuse?
Sure. So I've been working on this story for about a year now, and the cases that I've come across have reached the hundreds, and I feel like I've only very much touched the surface of this. So essentially what happens is, if you're a migrant care worker under the system that exists at the moment and has existed since around 2020, when Boris Johnson was in government, if you think back to 2020, we were in the middle of the pandemic. We had a huge shortage of care workers, the people who look after our elderly, our disabled, and we just had Brexit as well. So obviously a lot of the European people who were working in the country then had left, and we had this huge staffing crisis. Boris Johnson essentially wanted to create a system where we could allow people into the country easier to fill those vacancies in the care sector. And he created this health and care visa where employers in the country who needed to recruit from overseas could hand out certificates of sponsorship that essentially gave migrants in foreign countries the right to work in the UK. It was a certificate that said you have a job in the UK. The problem is people were selling these certificates for thousands and thousands of pounds, which is illegal. It is illegal under international law for workers to pay for a job opportunity for recruitment purposes. And the problem is that some of these people were getting legitimate certificates of sponsorship and were able to come to the country. Then they were often being exploited when they got here, which is a whole different kettle of fish. But a lot of people were being sold these certificates of sponsorship and never actually got them. They were being sold them fraudulently. They were being sold fake certificates. And the people who were in the UK, the businesses who were involved in selling those certificates of sponsorship, were often on the Home Office list of approved sponsors that were approved to hand out these certificates. So it really gets to the heart of the fact that the government was not doing proper checks. The system was not properly regulated, and it's ended up with millions of pounds just in the small number of cases that we've seen, essentially being laundered from people in developing countries through the UK and used to buy what we've seen, Range Rovers, property, investments, and it's absolutely sickening, to be honest.
And part of your story tracks down some of the people who've essentially taken matters into their own hands to try and establish where the money has gone. But what about the official response to this? What are the government and the police doing about it?
So I've had a number of conversations with various different people within the Home Office over the last few months, and to me it seems that they are not particularly aware of the problem that exists. I don't think they realise the scope of it. I don't think they realise the scale of it. And I would like to hope that there are some sort of internal conversations going on about how they might address this. But at the moment, I haven't seen any evidence of that. When it comes to the police, in terms of the people that we've been in touch with, the victims of this that we've been in touch with, we have urged them to go to the police. They go to the body called Action Fraud, which is part of the City of London Police, which deals with nationwide fraud reports. And many of them have now started reporting to Action Fraud. We saw over 300 reported last year. But Action Fraud then has the right not to pass on those cases to the police if they don't think there's a realistic chance of them being followed up, or if they don't think the police have the time to deal with these types of fraud. And with every case that I've seen that has been passed to Action Fraud has said, we decided not to pass this on to the police. We do know there are a couple of cases that we have reported to the police that are still under investigation. One of those is mentioned in the story. But at the moment, it seems that the authorities have largely decided to turn a blind eye to this.
So then how does this visa programme fit in also with the changes that the government is making to immigration and visa schemes?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because obviously we had Keir Starmer's immigration white paper announced this week, and that announced some massive changes to the way migration works in the UK. We're still to see a lot of the detail of that to come out, but we have one of the biggest changes in that white paper, which was announcing the end of overseas recruitment of care workers. So that means essentially the end of certificates of sponsorship for these people. And in a way that should stop future scams, because, you know, if you're in a country like Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and you've heard about this, then you know that there is no way to come to the UK as a care worker anymore. I mean, there's several issues with this. It depends on people in those countries actually knowing about this policy and knowing that they can't come to the UK anymore. So if someone tries to sell them a dodgy certificate of sponsorship, then they actually know that it's unlikely to be real. And then you've also got the issue that this is raising for the care sector. They are really worried about how they're going to be able to recruit enough staff now, because we're still seeing vacancies in that sector. And it's worth mentioning as well that this does nothing for the people who have been fallen prey to these scams over the past several years. It's not addressing the fact that they have lost tens of thousands of pounds. They've often sold everything they have in their country of origin, you know, their house, their land, their cars, the equipment they had for work. They are still out of pocket to the tune of thousands of pounds, which is a large amount of money when you're in a country like that. And they essentially now have absolutely no hope of the dream that they had of getting to the UK, because, you know, many of them literally pinned their life savings, their life's hopes on getting into the UK to be able to make a better life for themselves here. And they're essentially left now with no hope of ever doing that.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.